I'm Deborah Stevenson. I'm the director of the Center for Children's Books, and this is our annual Storytelling Festival. You will be hearing stories of all kinds from people of these kinds: students, staff, alumni, faculty. I knew there were 4. Thank you. The Center for Children's Books, which hosts the Storytelling Festival, is one of the Graduate School of Library and Information Sciences 3 research centers. We study youth literature, media, and culture. And we are housed in the glamorous garden level of the library school. Come and see us sometime down there with our wonderful research collection of children's books. If you are interested in being updated on future events hosted by the center, we have a mailing list. You can sign up in the foyer at the intermission or after the performance. If you're interested in buying any of our beautiful blue t-shirts or beautiful blue tote bags, they are also available in the foyer at intermission or after the performance. Tonight, we, for the first time, are videotaping the performance for broadcast on Urbana Public Television. We will, when we find out the broadcast time and date, announce that on our website, and probably just about every place else we can think of to announce it. So we're sure you'll find out. This event is technically hosted by the Center for Children's Books, but it is actually directed and coached and sweated into being by Professor Kate McDowell. Please help me in welcoming Kate McDowell. This is not Kate McDowell. But I am. And I'm so thrilled to welcome so many people here tonight. Thank you for making this event the spectacular thing that it is. I'm so grateful to all the folks who've helped make this happen. I'm going to thank them at the end. But right now, I just want to ask you for 2 logistical things, and then I want to tell you at least 2 fanciful things. Logistical things are, number 1, could you turn off your cell phones? Thank you so much. Number 2, it's not in the program, except as a sort of meta level, well, never mind. It's not in the program, but we will have an intermission. The intermission in picture book language is in the gutter. So that means the space between the 2 pages. In other words, for those of you who are more linearly inclined, we'll be taking an intermission break after Eating with Trolls, told by Sam Sednick, and right before, my very own self telling the true tale of Goldilocks and the 3 Bears, beginning off the second half. So we'll have I'm going to call it an 8-minute intermission, right? So we'll know that that means 10, but short. Okay, so that's the first. Those are the logistical things. The fanciful things are, why do librarians tell stories anyhow? I mean, what does library and information science and storytelling, how do these things go together? Well, let me tell you. First of all, children's librarians have been telling stories, not just reading aloud, for over 100 years. It's been one of the techniques that is actually part of our professional legacy that we still teach. I'm teaching it right now, that encourages young people to think of literature as something that's alive, that comes up off the page, and also to connect our print literature with the oral traditions from which much folklore comes. So it's important, I think, that stories are part of library collections. We have some people doing research on those kinds of library collections here tonight, Carol and Catherine. So it's part of our collections, but it's also part of our legacy professionally. But there's another reason why storytelling is important, and that is because storytelling is an incredibly effective means for organizing information. It works like almost nothing else, and if you think about it, probably the most important information in your life is organized into story in some way. The things that are most meaningful to most of us are things that we tell in narrative, we tell in story. I am thrilled to have here tonight for you a number of fabulous tellers. Among them are actually our 2 MCs for the evening. They'll be telling you stories later, but first they're going to host the event. Please let me welcome and introduce Miriam Larson and Sam Sednick.
Once upon a time,
in a land far away,
7 times 7 lands,
or very nearby,
there lived an old woman,
a young man,
or 3 bears at least,
you.
or me.
This is what the old ones told me when I was a child.
A story is a story. If you would like to hear it, hush.
But what is a story?
Everything's a story.
A story has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
A story can be anything that I want.
It tells us a moral. It teaches us a lesson.
It makes us laugh. It entertains us.
It makes us cry.
Then why do librarians tell stories? Why do we tell stories?
Well, Kate has given you a couple of reasons that we tell stories. I'll add to that by saying one of the great reasons that we tell stories is it gives us the chance to bring everyone together here tonight. And so I'm so glad to welcome you all. We have GSLIS community members, we have people from outside of GSLIS, librarians, non-librarians, all types of folks. And for centuries and centuries, humans have used storytelling, as Kate also described, to pass along information, culture, religion, and to entertain. I'm fairly confident that this group of humans will find something to relate to this evening. At this 8th Annual Storytelling Festival, we have quite a variety of stories. We have funny stories, serious stories, some traditional folklore, and one personal story.
And just as we have a lot of stories, we have a lot of different tellers. But I'm personally a fan of how Bill Hall said it. As a general rule, librarians are a kick in the pants socially. We're good-humored and progressive and naturally well-read. But we're also generalists, and we know so much about so many things, and we're quite the opposite of the boring old poops they have us made out to be. Most of us are full of life, and some of us are even full of the devil.
And with no further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first teller, Jennifer Stasinopoulos, who I first met at a CCB event where she was volunteering, and she brought her daughter. And she is truly a jack of many trades. She was that evening building a house, a mouse house out of a furniture box, all included with a fuzzy pink fireplace. And this evening, she's going to be telling a story about Clever Monka. And Jennifer is interested in youth services and is here studying at GSLIS. And I'm so happy to have her be our first teller. Please help me welcome Jennifer Stasinopoulos.
There once was a wealthy farmer who was as unscrupulous as he was greedy, and he was known for taking advantage of his neighbors. One of these neighbors happened to be a poor shepherd who worked for the wealthy farmer for 6 months in order to earn a heifer. But at the end of the 6 months, the farmer refused to give the shepherd the heifer. So the shepherd had no recourse but to take the case to the burgermeister, who was pretty new and inexperienced, but he was known for being wise. The two men presented their case to the burgermeister, who deliberated for a little while, and then said this: "I propose that instead of giving you a verdict, you solve a riddle, and whoever can give me the best answer to that riddle will be awarded the heifer." Well, the wealthy farmer didn't want to go against the burgermeister. He was new after all. He didn't want to start off on the wrong foot. And the shepherd, well, there was no way he could get the heifer without going along with this, so they both agreed. Here is the riddle. Tell me, what is the swiftest thing in the world? What is the sweetest thing in the world? And what is the richest thing in the world? Well, that night the wealthy farmer went home in a very agitated state. He went to the dinner table and he was very grumpy. "Oh, that new burgermeister, if it had been the old burgermeister, I could have just bribed him with some of my honey or barley, but no, he goes and gives us a riddle. And what am I with riddles? I'm terrible. We're going to lose the heifer for sure. Now wait on, honey, wait up a bit. Just tell me what it is, and maybe I can help you come up with an answer." So he told her. "Oh, well, that's easy. Well, isn't our horse the fastest thing in the road? No other mare, no other horse or cart can beat our mare. And isn't the sweetest thing our honey from our own bees? And isn't the richest thing, well, what could be richer than our chest of golden ducats that we've been saving up these 40 years? Well, the wealthy farmer, He was so excited to hear this answer, and he was confident that he was going to get his heifer back and lead her back to the field the next day. Well, the poor shepherd, truth be known, he wasn't very good with riddles either, so he went home in quite an agitated state as well. He told his daughter Manka when he came in what had happened, what the problem was. And she said, "Oh, Father, don't worry. I have a perfectly good answer. I'll tell you just what to say." So the next day, when the two men presented themselves before the Burgermeister again with their answers, the wealthy farmer gave the same answer that his wife had told him and then stood back, shoulders squared, in triumph. He knew he was going to take that heifer home. But the Burgermeister was not that impressed. Okay, shepherd, what do you have to say? What is your answer to the riddle?" Well, the shepherd stood up and he said, "Well, I think that the swiftest thing in the world would have to be thought, because it can take you from one place to another in an instant. And the sweetest thing in the world would have to be sleep, because what can be sweeter than sleep when a man is tired or sad? And the richest thing in the world, well, wouldn't that have to be the earth itself, since all other riches spring forth from it?" "Excellent, excellent," cried the Burgomaster. "You are awarded the heifer." Oh, well, he was excited, but the wealthy farmer went home and had another grumpy dinner that night. As the shepherd turned to go, the Burgermeister stopped him. "Now, shepherd, come here and tell me, who gave you that answer? Because I don't think it came out of your head." Well, at first, the shepherd didn't want to tell him, but the Burgermeister got it out of him that it was indeed his own daughter, Manka. This intrigued the Burgermeister, who thought he'd like to test this woman's cleverness again. So he called a servant and told the servant to bring him a basket with 10 eggs in it. And then he gave this basket to the shepherd, and he said, "Shepherd, I would like you to take this basket home to your daughter Manka and have her hatch these 10 eggs, these 10 fresh eggs, and bring me back the chicks tomorrow morning." Well, the shepherd was a little bit confused, but it was the Burgermeister. What could he say? So he brought the basket of eggs home just as he was told, and he told his daughter what the Burgermeister had said. "Oh, Father, don't worry, that's very simple, but what an interesting man to come up with such riddles. I think I should like to meet him someday. I'll tell you what to do. You take some millet and put it in a little bag and take it right back to the Burgermeister and tell him to plant it, grow it, and harvest it, and I would be delighted to bring my 10 chicks to feed upon his ripened grain on the morrow." So the shepherd did as he was told, and the Burgermeister laughed to hear such an answer, and he said, "You know, I think if your daughter is as comely as she is clever, I might very well like to marry her. Tell her to come see me tomorrow." Oh, somebody from his station, somebody from his family marrying up to the Burgermeister. It had never been heard of, certainly not in his family. Oh, he started to run out the door, but the Burgermeister stopped him. "Now hold up, shepherd. Tell her to come. Neither by day nor by night, neither dressed nor undressed, and neither walking nor riding." Well, again, he was a little bit dumbfounded, but it's the Burgermeister. What is he to do? So he went home and he told his daughter Manka what the Burgermeister had asked. "Don't worry, Father. I know just what to do," she said. The next morning, she got up very early, she undressed, and she wrapped herself in a fishnet. And then right at dawn, when night had finished, but it was not yet day, she left with one leg flung over a donkey, and with the other leg, she hopped all the way to the Burgermeister's house, which fortunately wasn't that far. Now, I ask you, Was she dressed? Well, of course not, for how can you call a fishnet clothing? But then again, she wasn't undressed either, because she was wrapped in a fishnet. And was she riding? Well, no, because she was hopping along the road with one foot. But then again, she wasn't walking, for she had one leg flung over the donkey. She came to the Burgermeister and she presented herself to him. I have come, sir, just as requested, neither by day nor by night, neither walking nor riding, and neither dressed nor undressed. Well, the Burgermeister was so taken with her cleverness, as well as with her beauty, that he proposed right then and there. But he said to her, before they made the engagement public, you must never get involved in my business. You must never offer advice to anyone who comes to my house to consult me, for on that day I shall surely send you from my house back to your father's house to live. Well, she saw the wisdom in this, so she agreed. And they had such a wonderful life together. They read literature together. They had long walks together. They were so well suited for one for the other. After a while, two men came to the house, two farmers. One of them had a mare in the marketplace that had given birth unexpectedly early to a little white colt, which got up quickly and ran under a hay farmer's cart, whereupon the hay farmer claimed the colt as his own. They presented their case before the Burgermeister, but unfortunately, the Burgermeister wasn't really paying much attention. So this is what he said for his verdict. The colt belongs to whosever cart he was found under. And then he dismissed the men. Well, as you can imagine, the owner of the mare left in quite a despondent state, and Manka saw him. And she took pity on him and asked him what the matter was. He told her, and she was very ashamed of what her husband had said. So she decided to help him. But she made him promise not to tell the Burgermeister who had helped him. The next day, as the Burgermeister was going through some papers in his upstairs study, some legal documents, he looked out the window and he saw a man spreading a fishnet over a dry and dusty road, which was kind of strange. So he went downstairs to see what was going on. He called out to them, "Ho, ho, ho there, what are you doing?" The man turned around and he recognized it was the same man, the owner of the mare, whose case he had heard the day before. He goes, "Why are you spreading this fishnet over the road?" "Well, it's a fishnet. I'm going to catch some fish," said the man. "Are you daft? You're going to catch fish over an open road. What are you thinking?" "Begging my pardon, sir, but I think I've got about as much chance of catching fish over a dry and dusty road as a hay cart does of giving birth to a colt." Well, the Burgermeister realized his mistake, so he promised to get the man back his colt. "But, sir, tell me, who gave you this idea? Because I don't think you thought of it yourself." Well, at first the man didn't want to tell him, but eventually the Burgermeister worked it out of him that it was his own dear sweet Manka who had helped him. So it was with a heavy heart that he returned to his house and called his Manka to him. "Manka, I told you that on the day I found out that you helped somebody, gave them an answer who came to my house for business, that would be the same day that I would send you back to your father's house to live. And you know I am a man of my word. But so that no one can say that I ill-used you, you may take one item from this house, the thing you value most, with you." Now, actually, this was actually a really kind thing to do because he was very wealthy, and some of the things in his house were very rare. So they could set a person up for life. "That's okay, husband. I know that you are a man of your word, and I will go. But please, allow me this one thing. Allow me to stay until after dinner so that we can share one last meal together." The Burgermeister agreed, and that night she made the most fabulous dinner for him. Oh, the table was laden with meats and roasted vegetables and desserts and wine, all the best wine from the cellar. The Burgermeister came to the table and saw the spread, and then he began to eat and drink. And he ate and he drank, and he ate and he drank, and he ate and he drank, and he ate and he drank late into the night until finally he fell asleep right there at the table. Manka called the servants and had him carried, chair and all, out to the cart that was waiting to take her back to her father's house. The next morning, he woke up with a start. Ho, 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 where am I? What's going on here? What's happening here? Manka walked just calmly into the room. Well, nothing's going on, husband. You told me that I could take the thing that I valued most from our house, and that would have to be you. Okay, Manka, let's go home. So the two went home, and they never quarreled again. But the Burgermeister was known to say on an occasion when he confronted a particularly difficult case, "I think we should consult my wife, for you know she is a very clever woman."
Thank you, Jennifer. I always love those stories about very clever women. Now, everyone comes to storytelling a little differently. I think I can remember my first story. I was about 6, and I broke my mother's tea set, and I came up with a whopper of a tale. But I was pretty ill-practiced at the time, and she didn't buy it. Our next teller is Michelle Bourgeois, and the first time I met her, it was in training at the Office of Instructional Technology and Design. And we were playing that game, 2 Truths and a Lie. And let me tell you, Michelle doesn't need a lot of practice to tell you a tale. When you can't find her up at the help desk, Michelle has been studying community informatics and public librarianship. And, you know, I'm going to leave the rest of this story to her. Michelle.
So like some of the other tellers here tonight, I am in Kate McDowell's storytelling class. And when I was looking for my first story, I really wanted it to be good. And so I was down in the Center for Children's Books, and I was just looking in book after book, trying to find a story, but I couldn't find anything that I liked until after what seemed like hours, I picked up this kind of old copy of a book called Folk Tales of Ireland. And one of the first stories that I opened to was one called The Man Who Had No Story. And I felt this instant kinship with it because I had no story, and neither did Rory O'Donoghue. But unlike me, Rory O'Donoghue lived in County Cork in Ireland with his wife. And his wife made the most amazing stockings. They were the kind of stockings that could keep your feet warm on even the coldest of winter nights. And Rory would go from town to town selling them. Well, on one of his journeys, a dense fog lay over the whole countryside, and Rory got very lost. He was walking and walking all day, and he had no idea where he was, and the fog didn't dissipate until nighttime. And by this time, Rory was very hungry and tired, but he happened to see a little cottage by the side of the road, and there was light coming from inside. So he went up to the door and he knocked, and an old man answered, who was hunched over and wizened with age. And when he saw Rory, he said, "Welcome, Rory O'Donoghue." Rory had never seen this man before in his life, but the man was welcoming him into his house, so Rory went in. And Rory got in, and the man said, "Have a seat, Rory O'Donoghue." And right when the old man said that, a chair from the other side of the room flew across the room right behind Rory O'Donoghue. So he had a seat. The old man shuffled around the table and plopped down in his own chair. He said, "Now, Rory O'Donoghue, now we eat." And right when the old man said that, a drawer in the kitchen opened, and a huge butcher knife rose high into the air. And it slammed down onto a piece of meat that was on the counter. And then it started cutting up the meat, and it cut up some potatoes, and an entire meal was made for them like this, without either of them lifting a finger. So Rory and the old man ate and drank and ate some more until they were very full. And then the old man leaned back in his chair and, rubbing his tummy, said, "Rory, do you know how I spend my evenings?" Rory shook his head and he said, "The first part is spent eating and drinking. The second part is spent telling stories and singing songs. And the third part is spent sleeping. So, Rory, tell me a story." Well, Rory looks at the man. He wasn't really known for his words, and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't know any stories." The old man looked a little confused for a minute, but then brightened up and said, "All right, well, sing me a song." And Rory apologized. I'm sorry, I don't know any songs." And the old man said, "All right, well, you'll have to be going then." And he kicked Rory right out of the house. Well, Rory started walking down the road, feeling more than a little dejected. But it wasn't long before he saw a fire not too far off. And as he got a little closer, he saw a man sitting next to the fire, and he was roasting what looked to be a pig on a spit. And as Rory got even closer, he saw that next to the man was a full-sized coffin. A coffin that could fit an entire person. So Rory was going to back away very slowly and quietly, but the man noticed him, and he said, "Welcome, Rory O'Donoghue." Rory waved hello, and the man said, "Rory, why don't you lay down in this coffin for me?" Rory said, "No, that's okay, I'm all right where I am, thanks." And the man said, "All right, well, at least roast this pig on the spit for me for a while." So Rory very cautiously and hesitantly took the handle of the spit from the man, who quickly got up and disappeared. Rory started turning the handle, and he looked down at the pig, and the pig opened its eyes, and it shouted at him, "Don't burn my whiskers!" Rory screamed. He threw the pig in the spit as far as he could away from him, and he ran in the opposite direction. But the pig and the spit and the coffin chased after him. And I don't know if you've ever been chased by a pig or a spit or a coffin before, but it is a terrifying experience. And Rory he ran faster than he had ever run in his life. But the pig and the spit and the coffin, they caught up to him, and they started beating him on the back. But Rory, he just kept running, and then he saw this house by the side of the road, so he ran as fast as he could into the house, and he flew open the door and shut it right behind him, but not before the coffin could get one last blow on his back. Rory paused for a moment to gather himself from this experience. And after a few minutes, he looked up and he realized that he was in the same cottage that he had been in earlier that evening. Well, the old man was in bed by now, but when he heard Rory come in, he sat up in his bed a little and he said, "Welcome, Rory O'Donoghue." And he said, "You know, I have this couch made up for you. Why don't you just stay here for the night?" And Rory looked at the old man and he said, "Thank you, that's very kind of you, but I couldn't possibly, I'm covered in blood." And the old man, as if noticing this for the first time, said, "So you are. What happened?" And Rory said, "Well, after I left here, I saw this man, and he was roasting a pig by a spit, and then he had this coffin. He wanted me to get in the coffin, but I didn't want to get in the coffin. And then I was turning the handle of the spit, and then the pig shouted at me not to burn its whiskers, so I ran all the way here, but it kept beating me all the way on until I got here, and now I'm all cut and bruised." And the old man looked at Rory, and then he smiled, and he said, if you had told me a story like that, you wouldn't have had to go out at all. Why don't you just clean yourself up and you can stay here for the night? So Rory did. And when he woke up, the old man and the cottage were gone. So Rory just got to his feet, gathered his large bag of stockings, and went on his way.
Thanks, Michelle. I will remember that if an old man, ever asks me a story, I'll make something up pretty quickly. Dan Ketting is a teacher of storytelling and a professional storyteller in town, and he's traveled to many places, and he will tell you that if you're at a storytelling festival that's not in the United States, you won't hear the kind of story that we're going to hear next. This next tale is a personal tale, which he considers a sort of American tradition of storytelling. Our teller has a story for us that many of us have, a story of arrival in this country. She was born in Ukraine and then came to Skokie, Illinois, and then here to study librarianship and youth services. And her story is called Pamilo, Can't Buy Me Freedom. Please help me welcome Julia Piatetsky.
The year was 1989, and I was 6 years old. I was standing at Chicago O'Hare Airport at the arrivals gate, and I was waiting. This was going to be one of the most important moments of my life. But in order for you to understand why it was one of the most important moments of my life, we have to go back to 1974 and to Kyiv, Ukraine, where my dad is in his mid-20s, a young man, and had just married my mother. My dad's a real character. He is incredibly intelligent, and he's got perfect pitch, great musical ear. I've always been jealous of that, but he loves music. And growing up, he would listen to the Beatles. It was one of his favorite bands. But unfortunately, in Ukraine and all of the USSR, Beatles were not allowed to come and perform, nor were their albums allowed to be sold. So my dad would listen to the bootleg Beatles tapes. And he particularly loved Can't Buy Me Love, and he did his best as he could to sing along with it. He couldn't speak English at the time. And he just sounded it out, and it went something like this. Pamilo, 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 ho. So Pamilo means broom in Russian. So very creative, very colorful man. But beyond that, it also showed his level of tenaciousness that he had, because the fact that it was illegal to listen to the Beatles didn't stop him. He wanted to listen to what he wanted to, and he did. And that wasn't, I mean, there were many things that happened in Ukraine and the USSR that were very anti-Semitic. There's a long-standing history in Ukraine of anti-Semitism. So my parents really wanted to get the heck out of Dodge at that point. So 1974, my mom and dad and my uncle, who had also recently gotten married to my aunt, and my uncle and my dad are brothers, they decided to go ahead and go to the United States. They wanted to petition. They wanted to get out. My grandparents also went ahead and petitioned with them, my dad's parents. And typical communist move, they love to split up families. And so it's exactly what happened. My uncle and my aunt were granted permission, as well as my grandparents, but my dad and my mom were denied. And my mom and dad ended up becoming refuseniks, Russian Jews that were refused permission to be able to emigrate from the USSR. And so my grandparents decided to remain because they didn't want to leave their youngest son in Ukraine by himself. But my uncle and my aunt decided to go ahead and leave. And so they did, and when they parted with my dad, the two brothers hugged, and they didn't know when or if they were going to see each other again. And another year passed, and my brother was born, and my dad began to learn English. He began to petition not just the USSR, but the American government as well to be able to come here. And my uncle on the other side in the United States also began to petition and got in touch with an organization called the Chicago Action for Soviet Jewry. And they got him in touch with congressmen and senators, and eventually it went up to the Secretary of State. But it was to no avail, because the Ukraine and the USSR refused to get my dad to be able to leave. He became a token at some point of the Cold War in that way. Well, a few years later, my grandfather suffered a stroke, and the communist government, yet again, denied my parents and my brother, but gave permission for my grandparents to leave. But they said that if they chose not to leave at that point, they would never get to leave. So worrying that they would never see their older son again, they decided to go ahead and go. And so my dad's parents and his brother were gone. He had my mom and he had his son, my brother. And then a few years later, I was born. And even that ended up becoming a battle, a bureaucratic battle with the USSR. In Ukraine and all over the USSR, they have a book, and it's filled with Russian names. And at that point, you could only name your children the Russian names that were in that book. And my dad, he put his foot down. He was not going to have it. He wanted to call his daughter whatever he wanted to call her. And my mom really wanted to call me Julia. She had seen a play, and she really liked the heroine's name. And my dad, he fought tooth and nail for this because he wasn't going to let the government tell him what to do. And he wanted to have control over naming his own child. And after more than 30 days of this, my dad actually got my name to be Julia, and that's what it says in the birth certificate. So there was a little bit of control that we had in that situation, but it was very limited because even our passports, under our nationality, it said Jewish. They specifically liked to be able to separate the people and ostracize and subvert them the way that they could. And so a few more years passed, and it was 1988, and my mom and dad, they just wanted their kids to be able to have a better life. And so it was decided that my mom, my brother, and I would leave. And we took a vacation to Moscow. And from Moscow, we flew to Rome, where we lived for a little while, in a suburb outside of Rome. And then we flew to Vienna, Austria. And then we flew to New York and then to Chicago. And this was a typical thing that many Russian Jews did at that time. And it was a way to be able to remain under the radar of the communist regime. But unfortunately, because my dad stood out, and he was a token at this point, there was no way that he could go and not be noticed. So he remained. And I remember when we arrived, the day that we arrived, and we went to my grandmother's house, and we were celebrating. And I remember my grandmother sitting on the couch, and she began sobbing and lamenting and wondering when or if she was going to see her son. And we didn't know. We didn't know what was going to happen. My dad was by himself at this point in Ukraine, and the communist government continued to play mind games with him. They told him he was never going to leave, that he would never get to see his family again. But that didn't stop my dad. He just put his head down and just did what he had to do. And he diligently sent photographs and music records and records that had stories on them that I grew up listening to, most of which was confiscated by the KGB and is probably sitting in a dusty basement somewhere in Ukraine. But we did get some of those things, and I was able to listen to some of the stuff I grew up listening to in my childhood. And then, with enough weight from Washington, D.C., finally, the communist regime decided to go ahead and grant permission for my dad to be able to leave. And so the year was 1989, and I was 6 years old, and I was standing at the Chicago O'Hare Airport, and I was waiting. I was waiting for my dad. And he finally arrived, and for the first time in 15 years, he was able to grab his brother and hug him, and for the first time in over a decade, to grab his parents and hug them. And for the first time in over a year, to grab his wife and his 2 kids. And it was amazing. It was a momentous moment. It was very joyous. It was a great reunion. And then a few months later, the Berlin Wall came down, and it was seen as a symbolic end to the Cold War and to communism at that point. But for me and for my family, that symbolic end was when my father stepped off that plane.
Thank you, Julia. That story gets better every time I hear it. Well, the personal narrative is kind of a newer form of storytelling, but we still have the traditional classics. And our next teller, Barrett Miller, has a great love for traditional stories. When she's not working at the Education and Social Science Library or developing programs for young people at Urbana-Free, Barrett Miller has been researching Beauty and the Beast. But tonight, she's here to breathe new life into the classic tale, Snow White and Rose Red. Barrett Miller.
There was once a cottage in the edge of the forest that was perfectly ordinary, except for the 2 rose trees, one white and one red, that grew on either side of the front door. The cottage belonged to a widow who lived there with her 2 daughters, her names Snow White and Rose Red, after the roses out front. As far as the sisters were concerned, they were as different as 2 girls could be. Snow White, the older sister, was quiet and gentle, and she helped her mother with the chores around the house. Rose Red, the younger sister, was wild and adventurous. She helped her mother by running the errands. Snow White found their quiet life fulfilling, while Rose Red found it dull and boring. Snow White's favorite thing to do was sit on the porch and daydream, but Rose Red loved to run through the woods pretending she was having an adventure. The sisters loved each other. They didn't always get along very well. Winter was the worst because their little cottage did not have quite enough room for the 2 girls and their mother, so they were constantly getting on each other's nerves. They fought frequently from about November till March. Everyone just spent those months in a very bad mood. One night, however, when the girls were almost grown, all of this changed. Snow White and Rose Red had just had a fight because Rose Red really wanted to play Monopoly, but Snow White just wanted to sit in a corner and read, thank you very much. And finally, their mother got fed up with both of them and told them to just stop it, and she couldn't understand why they couldn't all get along like a normal family for just 5 minutes. So they were sitting there, seething from the argument, and there was a knock at the front door. And their mother said, "Snow White, Rose Red, go answer it." Well, Snow White and Rose Red didn't want to answer the door. For one thing, it was cold, it was snowing, and for another, they lived in the middle of nowhere, and they had no idea who would be at their door at this time of night. But the sisters got up together, and they threw the door open. On the other side was a bear. And the sisters screamed, and they were about to slam the door in his face, and the bear said, "Wait." "Snow White, Rose Red, I mean you no harm. I need only a safe place to stay for the night." Well, this sort of thing was not entirely unheard of in their part of the world. And it was also considered very bad luck to refuse a magician anything. So the sisters let the bear inside. This turned out to be an excellent idea. The bear came every night that winter, arriving just after sunset and leaving just before dawn. And he never got tired of playing Monopoly with Rose Red, which, let me tell you, was quite a feat because that's all she ever wanted to do. And after everyone else had gone upstairs to bed, he and Snow White would stay up for hours talking. They found they had much in common. Best of all, the sisters stopped fighting completely. That winter, they got along perfectly all the time. It was a miracle. One morning in early spring, the bear turned to the sisters, and he said, "Snow White, Rose Red, I must bid you farewell. The snow has melted, and I must now go defend my treasure from the evil gnomes." I know, right? "I will return when the ground is frozen again." Well, this sort of thing was not entirely unheard of in their part of the world. Snow White and Rose Red were very sad to see him go nonetheless. And when he left, Rose Red cried. Snow White, who was dry-eyed, saw him catch his shoulder on the latch of the door as he was leaving. As he walked away, she thought she saw something glittering in the morning sunlight. She looked closer, and there on his shoulder, she was almost certain that there was a large, shining patch of gold. Snow White thought this was a bit odd, but she didn't say anything about it to her mother or her sister. Once the bear had left, Snow White and Rose Red assumed that their lives would return to normal. But the bear's presence had changed them. So subtly, so gradually, they hadn't even noticed a change had occurred. And Snow White tried to daydream like she used to, but all she could think about was the bear. She would think of something he'd said to her, and then she would wish he hadn't left. And because he had left, she would then wonder where he might be now. And she realized that without the bear, that her life, which had once been comfortable and fulfilling, now felt as if it was several sizes too small and stifling. Rose Red, on the other hand, well, she began to worry that maybe you only got one magical adventure in your life, and that she had wasted hers on an ordinary talking bear who played Monopoly. rather badly, in fact. And her dreams of adventure, which had once seemed so wonderful and so exciting, they didn't seem quite so wonderful and exciting anymore. She began to wonder if maybe they were even worth having at all. Now, the sisters responded to these changes by pretending that nothing was happening. Instead, they tried to go about things and do them just as they'd always done them. But the women they were becoming no longer fit those old roles. And the sisters found themselves clashing bitterly and unexpectedly at every turn. And that spring, they fought constantly, as if they were making up for the previous few months of good behavior. Well, their mother had been changed by the presence of the bear as well, and she had gotten used to having a little domestic tranquility around the house. And when spring turned into summer, and her daughters still could not get along, she finally put her foot down. She was sick of their bickering, and as punishment, she was sending them on errands together. Now, she did this for two reasons. Partly, she just wanted them out of the house so that she could have some time alone, peace and quiet. But the other reason she did this was because she hoped that forcing them to spend time together would maybe help the sisters learn to work through their differences. One day, Snow White and Rose Red were walking through the forest to chop some wood when they came upon a gnome with his long white beard caught in a fallen log. This sort of thing was not entirely unheard of in their part of the world, but it was considered more obnoxious than extraordinary. And when the gnome saw the sisters, he shouted, "Don't just stand there, get me out of here." Well, Snow White looked at Rose Red, and Rose Red looked at Snow White. Finally, Snow White sighed and cut the gnome loose. Of course, he wasn't grateful for their help. "Look at this, you've ruined my beautiful beard," he shouted. And then he picked up his sack of treasure and stomped off into the forest without a thank you. Now, a few days after that, Snow White and Rose Red were going down to the river to draw some water when they came upon the gnome a second time. When the gnome saw the sisters, he shouted, "Don't just stand there, get me out of here." Because, you see, his now slightly shorter, very long white beard was tangled in his fishing line. They were wondering at this point how the dwarf could be quite that clumsy. Well, Snow White looked at Rose Red, and Rose Red looked at Snow White. This time it was Rose Red's turn to sigh and cut the gnome loose. Still, he wasn't grateful for their help. "Look at this, you've ruined my beautiful beard again," he shouted. And then he picked up his sack of treasure and stomped off into the forest without a thank you. Now, a few days after that, the sisters came upon the gnome a third time when they were walking into town. At this point, they were really not excited to see him, especially because he was being carried away by a giant eagle. When the gnome saw the sisters, he shouted, "Don't just stand there, get me down from here." Well, this time Snow White and Rose Red didn't even bother to look at each other and sigh before they each grabbed the gnome by one of his legs and pulled him down to safety. Was the gnome grateful? No, of course not. He got up and dusted himself off and said, "Look at this, you've ruined my beautiful jacket. I ought to kill you girls for being such a nuisance." And then he reached into his sack of treasure, pulled out a long, sharp knife. Snow White grabbed Rose Red's hand, and Rose Red squeezed back, and they waited to see what the gnome was going to do next. Suddenly, from the forest, there was a loud roar, and a bear came charging at them. The gnome screamed, dropped the knife, and he ran away so fast that he tripped and fell into a neighboring ravine and was never heard from again. Well, the bear's skin slid away, revealing a handsome young prince in a suit of shining gold armor. Snow White and Rose Red were both a little surprised by this development, although Snow White maybe a little bit less than Rose Red. And the handsome prince said, "Snow White, Rose Red, thank you. Now that I have reclaimed my treasure and the last of the evil gnomes is gone, I can return to my human life. Snow White, will you marry me?" Well, Snow White, of course, had fallen deeply in love with the bear/prince. And so she burst into tears of joy and said yes enthusiastically. And Rose Red was happy for her sister, but she was also a little bit heartbroken, because it meant that Snow White would get to go off and have adventures while she had to stay behind instead. Well, as it turns out, this particular prince was heir to the throne, and he did not so much go on adventures as he went to meetings. His younger brother, however, was a dragon slayer, and he was more than happy to take Rose Red along with him on a couple of quests. So no one in the kingdom was very surprised a few months later when they too became engaged. Well, at this point, Snow White and Rose Red had stopped fighting, and everyone was pretty sure that this time they'd stopped fighting for good. And so the sisters sat down together to plan their weddings. And it could have been an area of great conflict, but they both agreed that, joint weddings really were kind of tacky, but they were also the most practical solution in this case. So that is what they did. And on the morning of the ceremony, their mother arrived at the castle with her arms full of red and white roses from the rose tree she'd named her daughters after. Snow White walked down the aisle carrying a bouquet of red roses, and Rose Red walked down the aisle carrying a bouquet of white. And their mother cried tears of joy, not just because her daughters had found love and happiness, because they finally realized that they were not quite so different after all.
Well, siblings that fight over Monopoly might also be interested in getting under each other's skin with a good ghost story. So this next story we have for you is a story about some spooky creatures. Our teller is not in youth services, actually. She's interested in special libraries, which have stories of their own. So please help me welcome Amanda Melcher with Strange Visitors.
There once was a sea captain who lived all by himself, but he was brave and adventurous, and he feared nothing on the land or sea. He also loved to read, and every night he would sit by his fireplace with a book, reading into the wee hours of the morning. One such night, as the captain read, a great storm raged outside. Rain splattered the windows, and wind moaned and groaned and howled through his old house. But the captain didn't let any of that bother him. He just continued to read. Suddenly, there was a thump at the door. The captain looked up and saw something large and dark moving right through the door. It looked like a tree stump wrapped all in black, and on its tree root-like legs it scuttled quickly and quietly across the floor, coming to sit between the captain and the fireplace. "What a strange visitor," the captain said. And then he went back to reading his book. A few minutes passed, and there was a second thump at the door. The captain looked up and saw something large and black moving right through the wood. It was another tree stump, wrapped all in black, and on its gnarled tree-like legs it scuttled quickly and quietly across the floor, coming to sit and join its companion between the captain and the fireplace. "Another strange visitor," the captain said, but he went back to reading his book. A minute passed, maybe less, and there was a third thump at the door. The captain looked up and saw something large and dark moving right through the solid oak. It was a third visitor, and like the other two, it scuttled quickly and quietly across the floor, coming to sit between the captain and the fireplace. "What odd visitors these are indeed," said the captain, but he went back to reading his book. After a few minutes, the visitors began to shift forward, moving until they had barely brushed the captain's shoes. The captain didn't look up. He simply pushed his chair back and continued to read. 2-3 minutes passed, and the visitors moved forward again, this time not stopping until they had touched the captain's legs. The captain simply pushed his chair back and continued to read. Less than a minute passed, and the visitors surged forward again, this time not stopping until they were right against the captain's legs. By now, the captain had grown annoyed. "What do you want?" he said. In unison, the visitors cried, "Hungry!" There's food in the cupboard, said the captain. In one dark voice, the visitors called out, hungry for you, hungry for you, hungry for you. Hungry for me, are you? Said the captain. He raised his book and whacked the first visitor. But the book went right through. Gripping his book tighter, raising it higher, he whacked the second visitor. But the book passed right through. He gripped his book again, raised it as high as he was able to, and struck the third visitor. But the book sailed right through. And before the captain could think of anything else to do, his feet were pulled out from under him, he hit the floor with a thwack, and he was knocked out cold. A little while later, the captain awoke, but the visitors were gone. The storm, however, had stopped. The rain was over, and the wind had died down. The captain picked himself off the floor, dusted himself up, and thought, what exactly had happened? But as he was looking around the room, he noticed that his chair was pushed back all the way against the wall. The captain thought about this for a moment, righted his clothes, picked up his book, and began to draw his chair closer to the fire. May the good spirits protect me from all such visitors as these, he said. And maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. Regardless, the captain settled back into his chair and began to read.
Thank you, Amanda. That's the sort of story that would keep me up all night long. Well, images, well, rather stories often evoke images. It's really been from the dawn of time. Can you imagine a band of hunters getting together in a cave after a hunt, and they have their fire flickering, and they have the paintings telling their hunt behind them on the wall, and then they tell their tale. Well, the visual arts and stories are great friends, and tonight we have the pleasure of having the first digital story hosted at the GSLIS Storytelling Festival. Ross Thompson is the creator of this story, and he once studied anthropology, and then he's studying academic librarianship now, but his hobby is writing, and I hope that you'll see that a little in the story called Catbeard.
Once there was a girl named Jane. She was quiet, but rebellious in her own way. She swore and she drank and she gambled, of course, and she kicked the shins of everyone who said that she read too many books. And perhaps because she valued adventure more than her mother's peace of mind, Jane turned to piracy at an early age. She had read all about pirates, of course, and she knew how to swashbuckle and when to say "Arr!" And she admired their positive attitude toward all of her favorite vices. And so she took the matter before her parents. "Arr," she said. "Daddy, I want to be a pirate." But her father was less than impressed. "Don't be ridiculous, Jane. I'm sure you meant to say that you want to join the Navy, and only boys can join the Navy." But Jane was not one to be deterred. "Arr," she said. "Mummy, I want to be a pirate." But her mother was less than impressed. "Don't be ridiculous, Jane. You're allergic to parrots, and how can you be a pirate if you're allergic to parrots?" But Jane still wasn't deterred. She simply gathered her belongings, and she gathered her cat, and then she set off for the docks in search of a villainous crew to sail with. And when Jane got to the docks, what should she see but a gruff-looking pirate captain standing beside his ship. She thought it best to introduce herself, and so she said, "Arr, sir, I want to be a pirate." "Arr yourself," the pirate captain said. "You don't meet the requirements." The requirements were really very simple. It is an unfortunate fact of life that every pirate, every single one of them, must have a beard. There can be no exceptions. "But I want to be a pirate," said Jane. "But you have no beard," said the pirate, "and we sail at dawn. If you've managed to grow one before then, come back, and maybe you'll have a place in my crew." Jane was not at all hopeful as she walked away from the pirate captain. In all her 8 years, she had never yet managed to grow a beard, and she didn't think that she would be able to succeed before tomorrow morning. But still she wasn't deterred. If she couldn't grow a beard, She would simply have to make one. And so, using a bit of ribbon and some string, she tied her cat to her chin. Surely this would fool the gruff pirate captain. When Jane returned to the docks, she again said "Arr," and told the pirate captain that she wished to join his crew. And then she swore a bit and asked for a drink, and the pirate captain was very impressed. He agreed that any man with such a glorious beard would be welcome to join his crew. All he needed was a name for this new crew member, and Jane, who by this point was a little drunk off her rum, said, "Call me Catbeard." All the rest of the crew were quite impressed as well. This tiny new pirate had such a glorious beard after all, and he swore and he drank and he gambled with reckless abandon. There were a few strange things about him, of course. He was really very small for a pirate, and he had atrocious table manners. Every night at dinner he would dip his beard in the fish soup. But then, every morning, his beard was clean and sleek, and no one really seemed to mind. The pirate Catbeard distinguished himself in battle as well. He always stood fast, saying "Arr," and just stroking his beard. The other pirates were still very impressed. "Oh, he's so brave," they said. "He's always so calm, and he displays such poise." And so, when the gruff pirate captain met his demise during one of their battles, it seemed the most natural thing in the world to elect Catbeard to take his place. Catbeard proved to be a forceful and effective leader, and Jane found that she quite liked being a pirate captain. There were a few problems, of course. She was allergic to parrots, for one, and gambling was growing increasingly difficult. It just raises awkward questions when your beard starts playing with the game pieces. But there was one problem that she couldn't ignore. The tiny kitten tied to her chin was steadily growing into an enormous, well-fed cat. A steady diet of fish soup and no exercise was not helping things at all. And having a beard that weighed a third again as much as she did was giving her terrible back problems, and her posture was beginning to suffer. "Arr," said the crew. "Why can't our captain stand up straight? Why, it looks as if he's collapsing under the weight of his own beard." Eventually Jane was no longer able to get a good look at her navigational charts, and it should come as no surprise then that the Navy was quick to pursue this example of erratic sailing. When they found that the ship was captained by none other than the notorious Catbeard, fighting was quick to ensue. The battle raged, and as always, Captain Catbeard stood fast, stroking his beard and saying "Arr." But things were beginning to look grim, and finally disaster struck. A stray sword cut Jane on the cheek, slicing through the string and ribbon that held her cat to her chin. There in the midst of the pirates and sailors, Jane's cat came tumbling free. And there are few things more dangerous than an angry, frightened cat in close quarters, especially one that wants to attach itself to the nearest available chin or throat. Needless to say, the few sailors who survived were quick to strike their colors. For the first time in 2 years, Jane was able to stand up tall and proud and fierce. And when the pirates saw that their beloved Captain Catbeard had no beard at all, they didn't mind one bit. Jane still called herself Catbeard, of course, because her notoriety preceded her, but she never wore a beard again, and she let her cat sit up on her shoulder. Parrots still made her sneeze, you see, but she was a perfectly good pirate all the same.
Ross, would you like to stand up? This is Ross who made this story. Could we all give him one more round of applause? So after we watched this in class, Ross commented on how he'd come up with the story, which was that he was walking down the street appreciating how his beard kept him warm and thinking, what if he didn't have one? Perhaps putting a cat onto his chin might be a good alternative. And so just as thoughts grow into stories, our next story is about a very thoughtful character, a young boy, and I get to welcome to stage my fellow MC, Sam Sednick, to tell the next story. As you have seen, her MC skills will serve her well as a public librarian, which is what she's interested in being after she graduates from GSLIS. Her tale tonight is Eating with Trolls. Please help me welcome Sam.
Once upon a time, there was a little farm tucked away next to the deep and dark forest. And on that farm, there lived a farmer and his wife and their 3 sons. The farmer was getting on in age, and it was time that his sons took some responsibility around the farm. Unfortunately for him, the eldest 2 sons liked bragging and boasting about all the things that they could do, but they very rarely did anything at all. And his youngest son, they called Ashlad, because day in and day out he would sit in front of the fire. And while his older 2 brothers rarely did anything, it was well known that Ashlad did nothing. Well, things went from bad to worse. First, there was no rain, and then it rained all the time. The frost came early and stayed late. The wind and the sun came at the wrong times. Spring was harsh, but summer was harsher, and in no time at all, that farm was ruined. Well, the only thing worth a penny was the wood tucked away at the edge of the forest. So the farmer called his sons to him, and he said, "Boys, we're going to have to change the way we make our living, and you're going to have to go out into the forest and cut down wood to sell." Well, his sons didn't really like that idea after all. Cutting down wood is a lot of hard work. But he reminded them that their only other option was to go out into the wide world and get a job. So the eldest son volunteered to go first. And he woke up the next day, and his mother packed him a nice basket with soft bread and hard cheese, and he took the family's axe and he went off into the forest. Now, he didn't pay any attention to the tall and majestic oaks or the middling pines. He was looking for the perfect tree, the smallest tree. He came right up to that smallest tree. He set down his basket, and he took up his axe, and he swung it straight into the tree. And then the sun disappeared. There were no clouds in the sky, and the wind did not bring them in. So he looked up, and there in front of him was the most massive troll. It must have been at least 9 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and it had ghastly gray skin. "Ho hum," said the troll. "You chop down my tree, and I'll cut you off below the knee." Well, he didn't like the sound of that, so he took the axe and he ran straight home, and he told his father what had happened. Well, the second son just laughed. He said, "Father, don't worry. I'm not such a ninny. Tomorrow I'll go into the forest and I'll chop down a tree." And so the next day he woke up bright and early. His mother packed him a basket with soft bread and hard cheese, and he took the family's axe and he went off into the forest. Now, he didn't pay any attention to the majestic tall oak or the middling pines. He wanted to find the perfect tree, and he found the smallest one with a convenient axe chop already in it. So he set down that basket, and he picked up his axe, and he swung it straight at the tree. And sure enough, the sun disappeared. There were no clouds in the sky, and the wind didn't bring them in. And when he looked up, the saucer-like eyes of the troll were glaring down at him. "Ho hum," said the troll. "You chop down my tree, and I'll cut you off below the knee." Well, his elder brother might have been stronger, but that second son was faster, and he was home before you could blink. The farmer despaired. But the very next day, Ashlad himself got up and dusted himself off in front of the fire, and he told his father that he would go off into the woods to try his own luck. His mother was just as surprised, and she told him that she was all out of baskets, and she only had a hard crust of bread and a soft curd of cheese still dripping in whey. But Ashlad didn't mind, so he took his grandfather's knapsack and that hard crust of bread and that soft cheese, and he set out into the forest with his knapsack and the axe. He took a little bit more time than his brothers, and he admired the oak trees. And when he got to the middling pines, there on the ground was a little bird that was fluttering about because it had exhausted itself out in flight. Ashlad was a kind-hearted boy, so he stopped and he offered his crust of bread to that bird. But it didn't recover, so he picked it up and he tucked it in his shirt next to his heart. and then he continued on the way. When he got to that short tree with 2 chops in it, he set down his knapsack, and he picked up his axe and swung it at the tree. And of course, the sun disappeared, and the troll said, "Ho hum." But Ashlad stopped him right there. "Mr. Troll, you don't need to threaten me with death. I'm not here to chop down your tree. I'm here to make a wager with you." Because you see, during all those years when Ashlad was sitting in front of the fire, he had not been idle. He had been thinking, and he knew some things about the world. He knew that trolls were ugly and they were strong, but they were also kind of stupid. So, he said, "Mr. Troll, I have a wager. It is called higher, harder, and fill your belly. If you beat me at this wager, you can eat me. But if I beat you, I get to eat you." Well, the troll liked the sound of that because he was pretty certain he could beat this little boy at a wager. And so the troll said, "Well, what does it entail?" And Ashlad told him, "The person who can throw a stone higher will win the first task. The second task is to see who can squeeze a stone harder, and the third one is to see who can fill their belly the most." Well, the troll liked the sound of that, and so they shook hands, and the troll found the biggest boulder he could find. He picked it up, and he threw it straight into the air, and of course it went past that small tree and the middling pines, straight up beyond the tops of the majestic tall oaks, where it spun once, twice, and then fell to the ground. It hit the ground so hard that the earth shook. And the troll grinned. He was certain he had won that first task. Ashlad took his time looking for a stone on the ground. And when he bent down, he didn't actually pick a stone off the ground, but he took that bird from out of his shirt and he threw that straight up into the air. It had recovered, and it went past that small tree and past the middling pines straight on up. And the troll watched and waited and waited. But it didn't come down, and so Ashlad had won the first task. The troll was embarrassed, so he went and had to find the perfect rock for the second task. And he found a big brown boulder. He picked it up and he started to squeeze. And as he squeezed, his hands got closer and closer, and the stone creaked and it groaned, and then it crumbled to dust at his feet. And the troll grinned because he was sure he had won the second task. Ashlad took his time looking for the perfect stone, and when he reached the ground, he didn't actually pick a stone off the ground, but he went into his knapsack and got that curd of cheese. It was smooth and off-white and looked just like a stone, and he started to squeeze. And as he squeezed, the whey started dripping out of it. And Ashlad said, "Mr. Troll, you may have been able to crush a stone to dust, but I could squeeze water out of one. It is clear I've won the second task." The troll was getting a little nervous, and he asked Ashlad where they would do the third task. Ashlad pretended to think about this, but he knew he couldn't take a troll home with him. So he said, "Well, Mr. Troll, we'll go and do the eating contest at your house." And so off into the forest they went until they found the troll's cave. And the troll had 2 big gallons of water, and he asked Ashlad to go and fill them. Ashlad looked at them and shook his head, and he said, "I don't need those. I'll just go and pull up the well instead." Well, the troll knew that this boy was awfully strong, and he didn't want to lose his well. So he said, "Oh, no. You stay right here and mind the fire. I'll go get the water." And when the troll left, Ashlad took his knapsack and tied it around his neck and stuck it down inside his shirt. And when the troll came back and prepared the porridge, they were ready for the eating contest. The troll took big scoops of porridge straight into his mouth and down the sides of his face. And Ashlad took great scoops of porridge too, but most of it went into the knapsack, which got fuller and fuller. At a certain point, Ashlad picked up his knife and he stuck it into his shirt and into the knapsack until the porridge spilled out. He said, "That is so much better," and he continued to eat.
The troll was impressed, and he was getting awfully full of food too. And so Ashlad offered his knife. "Doesn't that hurt?" said the troll. "Oh, no, not at all," said Ashlad. And so the troll took the knife and he stuck it straight into his stomach. And out spoiled the porridge and his stomachs and some intestines and some other things as well. And that was the end of the troll. Well, Ashlad looked around and there was a heaping pile of gold and silver, of course, stolen from the surrounding villages. And he took that back home with him and he gave it to the villagers and his family, and they heralded him as a hero, and they wanted to make him king. But he had none of that. He went back to sitting by the fire day and night, night and day, because it was all of that thinking that helped him defeat the troll the first time, and he was going to be ready the next time round.
So the last story before the program was about a sort of quiet and thoughtful character, Ashlad. And sometimes we stereotype librarians to be a little bit quiet and thoughtful, but the next teller I have to introduce for you likes to do a little more shouting and singing, and that is Assistant Professor Kate McDowell. And she has an original story song for you this evening. I should say first that Kate, if you don't know her, is a teacher here, and she is the professor of the storytelling class this semester. She's a very enthusiastic teacher. She also does research on children's literature and is a former public librarian. So I am excited to introduce this true tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And knowing that she is a professor and an academic, I assure you that it is well researched and very true. Please help me welcome Kate McDowell.
Thanks. Keep that on your side. Great. Yep, turn that around. There we go. That starts to do what we need to do here. So, there we go. I don't know about you guys, but the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears has never made any sense to me. I mean, this little blonde girl goes into somebody's house, turns out to be a bear's house, tries their furniture, tries their food. It's like some kind of HGTV show gone just very, very wrong. And that's because it's not what really happened. And this is what really happened. Goldilocks was hanging out in the woods, looking for trouble and up to no good. Spied a little cottage off on its own, so she cased the joint and found nobody home. Nobody home. Just in case she gave the door a knock, there was no reply, so she picked the lock. In the living room she found 3 chairs, so she tried them all, with nobody there. Nobody there. Well, the first chair was the biggest of the 3, but she found that it was hard and not comfy. Second chair was soft and just as bad, so she tried the smallest chair, and then she said that's just wrong. I don't like that chair at all. That's just wrong. So she smashed the chair against the wall. Yeah, she smashed the chair right against the wall and kicked the pieces into the hall. She went upstairs to take a look around. 3 beds were all she found. All she found. Well, the first bed, it was hard and had no bounce. The second bed was soft and just collapsed. The third bed looked like it might have some spring, so she jumped on it as hard as anything. And she said, that's just wrong. That bed just totally broke. That's just wrong. That probably was not even oak. So she went back down to where she smashed that chair and found 3 bowls of porridge sitting there. The biggest bowl was way too hot, and the middle bowl, well, kind of looked like snot. Kind of looked like snot. Smallest bowl looked more or less all right, so she thought she'd try it out and take a bite. but that porridge tasted really, really bad. So she smashed the bowl against the wall and said, well, she said, that's just wrong. I did not like that one bit. That's just wrong. That porridge tasted like, shut the front door. No, that's what Goldilocks actually said, because there were 3 bears coming in the front door. Goldilocks backed into the hall, and she picked up a piece of that smashed chair, a leg that had a really splintery end. And Goldilocks said, back off you 3, because I'm not going back to juvie. She held the leg of that smashed up chair and brandished it and walked out past those bears, right past those bears. Well, the biggest bear was stunned from all the trauma. The middle bear called the police to handle the drama. The smallest bear saw all his stuff was trash. His chair, his bed, his porridge, all were smashed. And he said, that's just wrong. I hope they make that blonde pay. That's just wrong. I can't believe she got away. Now this may not be the story you know, because the bears kept the truth on the down low. After all, they had a reputation as bears, as the ones being scary, not being scared, not being scared. Goldilocks was never apprehended, and that's about how that story ended. Sometimes the bears still sing this song, and they always say, that's just wrong. That's just wrong. That's just wrong. That's just wrong.
So wrong, but so right. I am delighted to be able to introduce my co-MC and the Outreach GA at the Center for Children's Books, Miriam Larson. Miriam's been exploring new ways to understand old stories, and the story that she has for us tonight is one that she has a wonderful personal touch with, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I have. The next story is called East of the Sun and West of the Moon. Miriam Larson.
In a land far away, the place that we now call Norway, there lived a girl, and her name was Karen. Karen had always wanted to travel, but she was the youngest daughter of a poor woodcutter, and so she had little opportunity except through her imagination. And so she would go on long walks through the woods and listen intently to the stories that her parents would tell her. Until the day the white bear arrived. She had grown into a young woman, and she was cooking dinner that evening, and they heard a knock at the door. It was a stormy night, so they didn't know who it could be. But her father went to answer the door, and he opened it, and there stood a giant white bear. And the bear spoke, and it said, I have an offer to make you. I will make you as rich as you are now poor. If you will allow me to take your youngest daughter with you, I will take good care of her. Please consider it. Well, Karen had followed, and she looked up at this white bear and saw something kind in his eyes, and turned to her father and said, Father, I will go, for we are very poor, but I am not afraid. Well, the family was very sad, but Karen packed up her things. She put on her cloak, she said her goodbyes, and she went out the door. She climbed onto the back of the white bear, and she got the cloak up over her head so the rain wouldn't get at her. She clung to the back of the white bear, and he began to run. And he ran through the woods and up and up and up over the ridge until they were passing outside of the valley that Karen had grown up with. And she was off on a journey, as she'd always wished that she would be able to do. Well, they traveled all night and all day until finally they reached a tall hill. And the bear lumbered up to the side of the hill, and he knocked on it, and there materialized a door. And they passed through the door, and Karen found herself inside a magnificent castle. She couldn't believe her eyes. The bear turned to her and handed her a small silver bell and explained that if she wanted anything, she only had to ring the bell and ask for it, and it would appear. And then he disappeared down the hallway. Well, Karen rang the bell and she asked for something to eat. She walked into the next room and she found a giant feast laid out. And so she sat down to eat, and she ate until she could eat no longer. And then she rang the bell. She walked into the next room and found a bedroom with a nightgown laid out for her. And so she climbed into the nightgown and climbed under the covers, blew out the candle, and was about to fall asleep when she heard a noise. Someone was coming in and climbed into bed next to her. And then the voice of the white bear spoke, and it said, "It is only I. Sleep." Well, the white bear didn't touch her, and eventually she heard his breathing calm until he must have been asleep. But she lay awake, startled, for a long time, until finally she succumbed to her exhaustion. In the morning when she woke up, the white bear was no longer beside her, and this happened each night when she was in the castle. She began to grow accustomed to it, for he would never touch her, and he would always reassure her that it was only he. During the days, she would explore the castle from the deepest dungeons to the tallest turrets where she could look out the side as if she was looking out the side of the tall hill. But her favorite place was a small reading room with 2 armchairs and a cozy fire. And she would sit and she would think, and she would choose a book off the shelf to read. And often the white bear would join her. And they got to know one another. The white bear asked her about her life growing up in the valley, and so she told him. And she told him some of the stories that her parents would tell her. And, well, he had some amazing travel stories, but Karen wanted to know about his child, about why they were in this castle. He would never say anything. Well, this bothered Karen, but, well, they shared stories, and they liked it. They found they had met much in common, and so Karen began to feel that they were friends, and she settled into her life at the castle. But as they talked and as they shared stories, and Karen told more and more about her life growing up, well, it seemed odder and odder that the bear would never say anything about himself. You may have had a friend who you like very much and whose opinions you trust, but, well, if they never say anything about themselves, you begin to feel that they don't trust you. And so it was with Karen and the bear, that after a time, Karen began to draw inward and feel like she couldn't trust the bear. After a time, the bear asked her what was wrong, and, well, she admitted that she was very lonely. With mysterious sorrowfulness, the bear offered to take her home, but on one condition. Her mother would want to pull her aside. She must not let her, because the bear feared that this would bring them terrible bad luck. Well, Karen agreed. She couldn't wait to see her family. And so the next day, they traveled the long distance back to their family's cabin. And it was a joyous reunion, and they feasted. And sure enough, afterwards, Karen's mother pulled her aside. But Karen, in a moment, thought, the bear has given me no explanation. Why should I obey his rule? And so she went with her mother, and she told her mother about the castle, and she also told her mother that the bear would climb in after she'd blown out the candle, and her mother became very worried that perhaps this was not a bear, but a troll. And so Karen's mother gave her a small stub of a candle to hide in her sleeve with a match. And after they'd traveled the long journey back to the tall hill and the castle underneath, well, Karen went to bed and she slipped that candle into her nightgown. And after she crawled into bed, she waited. She blew out the candle and she waited until the bear came. And she heard him get in, and she listened until his breathing stilled, knowing that he was asleep. Well, she got up, and she took her candle, and she walked around to the other side of the bed, and she lit that candle. And there in front of her was not a bear, but a man, a handsome man, with a very sorrowful expression on his face, so much so that a wave of tenderness passed across Karen, and she leaned over to kiss his furrowed brow. But as she did so, 3 drops of wax spilled onto his shirt. He awoke with a start, and anger flashed across his face. And then he sighed. "You spoke with your mother, did you not?" Well, Karen admitted that she had. But she said to him, "You have given me no explanation. I would have thought that after this much time, you would know that I am not so shallow as to obey rules with nothing of an explanation." Well, finally, the bear, who was now a man, told his story. He had been a prince. And then he had come upon an evil troll who had cursed him because he had refused to marry an evil troll princess, the troll queen's daughter. And, well, he'd been cursed. He'd been cursed to be a bear by day and a man by night, and the only way to break the curse was to find a woman who would live with him for a full year without revealing his true identity. All Karin could think as she heard this story was, what woman would stay with a strange bear for a whole year with not a single explanation? It was preposterous. She couldn't believe it, and so they began to argue, and they argued all night long, and it was the first honest conversation that they'd had. As morning approached, they began to see eye to eye, because the man admitted that perhaps it had been foolish to think that Karin might live with him for a whole year without a bit of explanation or background. And Karin admitted also that perhaps the prince, had had no choice but to try. Well, just then, the sun rose, and Karin found herself alone at the base of the tall hill with only the clothes on her back and her cloak and a small pouch. And she looked down at her hands that had grown soft in her time in the castle, but softness was not what she needed now, for she had a journey to set out on. The prince had said that if she was not able to stay with him the whole year, he would have to return to the castle that lay east of the sun and west of the moon to marry the troll princess. And so Karin had a journey to make to help a friend who could no longer help himself. She set out, and it was a long journey, and she met few people along the way, but she did meet 3 wise women who each gave her a golden apple to help her along the way. They couldn't tell her where the castle that lay east of the sun and west of the moon was, but the last one directed her to the east wind. Well, the east wind didn't know either, but the east wind took her to the west wind. The west wind took her to the south wind, and it was not until she arrived at the north wind that she found a being who knew where the castle that lay east of the sun and west of the moon was. And the north wind took her there, and she arrived on a shore, and she looked up, and there was a castle. She dusted herself off from her very long journey, and she pulled out one of those gold apples for comfort. And she approached the castle, and in the side, a door opened, and a long, ugly nose poked out, and it said, "What do you want for that apple?" "Well, it's not for sale," said Karin. "Well, what can I give you in exchange?" And Karin had a thought. "I will give you this apple if you allow me to spend one night by the side of the prince." "Done," said the voice. Easy as that, Karin entered the castle. And it seemed that this troll was the troll princess herself. The troll princess led her to a room where she had to wait until evening when the prince was asleep. And then she was led into the room of the prince. And she went over to the prince, and she tried to wake him, and she shook him, and she yelled his name, but he would not wake. And she tried all night long, and she could not wake the prince. When morning came, a servant came to lead her out, and so she traded her second apple for a second night by the side of the prince, but still she could not wake him. And by the time she was about to give away her third apple, she did not know what she was going to do. But the good people of the castle, the servants, had heard that there was a young woman who was trying to wake the prince. And so they told him, and he realized that the troll princess must be putting a potion in his wine. That evening, he only pretended to drink his wine, and then he went to his room and he pretended to sleep. And when Karin came in, he woke up, and it was a joyous reunion because they never thought they were going to see one another again. And the prince could not believe that she'd made such a journey all the way to help him. Well, they had some planning to do, and so they set to planning, and they finally came up with something that they hoped would work. The next day was to be the wedding of the prince. And so everyone gathered in the great hall in the morning, and the prince stood up to make an announcement. "So that I may know that my wife is worthy, I would like to ask her to perform a task. I have this shirt. It has 3 drops of wax. I would request that she simply wash the wax off the shirt. Well, the trolls thought this was simple enough. And so the troll princess stepped forward. She called for a container of water with some soap, and she began to scrub. And she scrubbed, but the wax wouldn't budge. Well, the queen thought this was ridiculous. She came over and she said, "What are you doing, daughter?" And she grabbed the shirt and she began to scrub, and she scrubbed and she scrubbed. But the spots only got larger. Well, the troll servants tried, and they could do nothing either. Until finally, the prince called a halt. He said, "This is preposterous. Why, even that beggar woman in the corner, a human, could do this." And Karin stepped forward, and she grabbed the shirt, and she walked right out of the great hall, and out of the castle into the sun, where she laid the shirt out in the sun so the warmth of the sun could warm the wax and loosen it, and then she began to pick at it. Well, the troll princess and the troll queen and all of the troll servants were so jealous and curious by this human woman that they followed her out of the great hall and out of the castle. And if you know something about trolls, you know that when they step into the sun, they turn to stone. And so, first the troll princess, and then the troll queen, and then each of the troll servants walked out into the sun and turned into statues. And the curse that was on the prince was broken, and Karin and the prince and all the people of the castle rejoiced, and they traveled the long distance back to the place that we now call Norway. And that is the story of Karin's first journey.
I was thinking there, between Miriam's story and Jennifer's story, I'm going to be a lot more careful when I drink wine. Well, we influence stories, but stories can sometimes influence us as well. Our next storyteller, Hal Southern, had already graduated from GSLIS when he wandered into Dan Ketting's storytelling class, and he's never looked back. He's an up-and-coming local storyteller now, and you might have seen him at last September's CU Folk and Roots Festival at Urbana-Free. And if you get a chance, you should ask him about the storytelling open mic at Das Cafe. But for tonight, he's going to share with us a bit of his life experience by telling us a tale of an unforgettable camping trip. Hal Southern.
I was born and raised in North Carolina. And one summer, a friend and I decided that we wanted to go camping in the North Carolina mountains. And we decided to go camping on Shumat Mountain. Now, Shumat Mountain is in western North Carolina. It's directly opposite Chimney Rock Mountain. And I had an aunt that had a cottage in the mountains, so of course we had to go stay with her the first night. And she fixed us fried chicken, rice, and gravy, and all the fixins, and my favorite thing of all, frozen fruit salad. And the next day, my friend and I, we left on our camping trip. And before we got to Shumat Mountain, we passed a yard, and there were some boys playing kick the can in the yard. And one of the boys said, "Hey, where are you guys going?" And I said, "Well, we're going camping up on Shumat Mountain for a couple of nights." And he said, "Well, we're going to go up there tomorrow night to camp out." And I said, "Well, then maybe we'll see you up there." We introduced ourselves to them and found out that they were brothers. Their names were Ray, Rex, Red, Rob, Rod, Roy, and Ron. Apparently, their parents liked names that began with the letter R and only had 3 letters in them. We said goodbye to them, and we went on up Shumat Mountain to hike and find a place to camp for the night. And the next day, those 7 brothers left on their camping trip. But they didn't even leave their house until dusk. And even before they began climbing Shumat Mountain, night overtook them. And they came to where the path was running alongside a river, and the moon was shining bright. And Ray looked over into the river, and he saw the moon shining down in it. And he said, "Look!" And all the brothers stopped and looked. And Ray said, "What in the world is that now?" And Rex said, "It's a yellow cheese." And Rob said, "No, it's not." Rob was the biggest brother and the oldest one. He said, It's a lump of gold. And you know what? We're going to get it. And Rex said, how are we going to get it out of there? And Rob said, faith, I'll tell you. You see that tree there? We're all going to climb up into that tree, see? Then we're all going to climb out on that limb that hangs just over where the lump of gold's at, see? Then I'm going to hang down from that limb, see? And one of you's going to climb over me and take me by the heels, see? And then another one of you's going to climb over us, see? And take him by the heels, see? Then another one of you's going to climb over us and take him by the heels, see? And then we'll all get strung down like that, see? Till the last one of us can grab hold on that lump of gold, and then he'll pass it up, see? And when it gets to me, I'll take it down, see? And we'll divide it up, break it, and then we'll take it home to Mom and Dad. And we'll be rich forevermore. Do you see now? Well, all the brothers thought that Rob was so smart to have come up with such a clever plan. And it wasn't too long before that seventh brother was climbing down into the bottom place, holding on by one hand and reaching for the lump of gold with the other one. But that string of brothers, they got to swinging just a little bit. And Rob, who was holding on to the limb of the tree, his hands were beginning to slip. And Rob said, whoa, down there, you guys hold on tight. I got to spit on my hands. And Rob let go. And there those boys were, struggling and strangling and beating the water with their hands. Well, Rob, he could swim, so he got out quick and reached him a pole and dragged him out. And Rob said, oh, brother, now look what you've done. And one of our brothers might have got drowned. Now stand up there and let me count you. Well, those boys stood there, water dripping off of them. And Rob said, me and myself and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Oh no, what are we going to do now? This one brother's got drowned. And first one and then another would try to count. But none thought to count himself in. So they just sat there all night, staring at the water, looking for their lost brother, crying and carrying on over it all, until it was morning, daylight. And that's how we found them as we climbed down the mountain that morning. They were sitting there a-crying and a-hoo-hooing, and I asked them what was wrong. And Rob told us about how they tried to get the big lump of gold out of the river the night before and how surely one of their brothers was drowned. And I said, well, how many of you were there to start with? And Rob said, well, there were 7 brothers in this family before that one got drowned. And I said, well, there's still 7 of you. And Rob said, no, there's not. We've already tried all that counting business. We just know one's got drowned. They wouldn't believe me. Then my friend got an idea. He pointed to a ripe cow pie over in the middle of the path, about half dried up. And he made all those brothers go and stand around it. And then my friend said, you fellas get down on your knees and stick your noses in that. And then count the holes your noses make. And you'll see. Well, all those boys got down and they stuck their noses in. And then Rob sat back and counted 7 holes. And then they all counted to make sure. And then all at once they broke out laughing. We're all here. None of us got drowned. And then they thanked my friend and I, and on they went with a little piece of the cow pie on the end of their noses. Now, I expect they went on up the mountain to hike and find a place to camp for the night. But maybe they didn't. If they can walk around with that on the end of their noses and not know it, anything could happen. As my friend Daniel's mother always says, 1 boy, 1 brain. 2 boys, half a brain. 3 boys, no brain. 7 brothers, frightening.
We have one final story for you this evening. The last teller is Sue Searing, a familiar face here in GSLIS. She's our LIS librarian. And if technology has put youth and innovation in the spotlight, sometimes storytelling reminds us of the importance of age and experience, and I think you'll gather this from Sue's tale about the wise old woman. Please help me welcome Sue Searing.
Once upon a time, there was a kingdom, and this kingdom had a rather young king. Now, for a long time, things were good there. The people were happy and healthy, and the economy was strong. All day long, the roads were filled with carts piled high with goods and produce on their way to the markets. But then, hard times came. There was war in the neighboring countries, and although that young king managed to keep his country at peace, the trade routes were cut off. People grew poor. They didn't have enough of the things they needed. And after a while, even food became scarce. So the young king knew he had to do something. And he thought, and he looked around, and he said, why are we wasting our resources on all these useless old people? Why are we giving them food when we hardly have enough to eat ourselves? They've lived their lives. It's time for us to live ours. And so the king issued an order. Everyone over the age of 50 would be rounded up, marched into the forest, and left to fend for themselves. Now, to be honest, the people under the age of 50 didn't think this was such a good idea. But he was the king, so what could they do? When the soldiers came to take away their parents and their grandparents, oh, they cried. They hugged their relatives tight. They gave them as many supplies as they could spare. But they didn't try to stop it. There was one man, though, who could not bear the thought of letting his mother go. The way he looked at it, she had given him his very life. His father had died when he was just a little boy, and his mother had raised him up by herself. She had nurtured him and taught him everything he knew, and he was not going to abandon her. So, before the soldiers came to their neighborhood, he hid his mother down in the cellar. Well, things went from bad to worse in that kingdom. That summer, there was a drought, and the crops withered in the field. And at harvest time, there was barely enough grain to make bread. There was nothing left to feed the chickens or the sheep or the cows. So when winter arrived, the cold winds whistled through the empty barns. Now, the people had been prudent. They had set aside some food in the times of plenty, just in case of an emergency like this. So by careful rationing, they were able to survive. Oh, they grew thinner and thinner. They were hungry all the time, but they lived. And whenever that young man got a small ration of food, he would take it down into the cellar and share it with his mother. And they would sit together in the semi-darkness, and they would reminisce about the good old days when there was enough of everything. And then one day, before the winter was over, the food ran out. The storehouses were empty. The supplies were completely gone. And then the people did what they had said they would never do. And they began to eat the potatoes and the corn and the wheat berries and the seeds that they had set aside for planting in the spring. And this filled their bellies, but it crushed their hope. Because they knew that without seeds to plant, they faced certain starvation. The man went down into the cellar empty-handed. He sat with his mother, and he said, "Isn't there something we can do? This famine goes on and on and on." And his mother said, "Oh, my son, don't upset yourself. Spring is coming." "Mother, what good is spring without seeds?" "Oh, it's come to that, has it? Well, you must do as I say. When the weather gets warm and the ground is soft again, go out and dig up the road in front of the house. Plow it and rake it, and then just sit back and wait. And oh, my boy, stop worrying. Well, the man wondered if spending so many months down in that dark cellar had begun to affect his mother's mind. But he was an obedient son. So when spring came and the ground thawed, he went out to dig up the road. Now the mule was dead, so he hitched the plow around his own emaciated waist. And as weak as he was from hunger, he dragged it back and forth over the road, and then he raked it. The very next day, the first rains of spring began to fall, and before long, little green shoots came up in the middle of the road. And it was corn and wheat and oats and barley and even some beans. And the man was amazed. He called his neighbors, "Come, see." And they were astonished too. They said it was a miracle. Well, it had to be a miracle, didn't it? Because how can you reap what you haven't sown? Well, word of this miracle spread far and wide around the kingdom, and it wasn't long before the king himself showed up to see it. And he asked the man, "What did you do here?" "Oh, Your Highness, I just plowed and raked the road." "Yes, but how did you even think to do this thing?" "Oh, Your Highness, I just took my mother's advice." "Your mother? But your mother's off in the forest somewhere." "Isn't she?" Well, then the man had to confess, no, his mother hadn't gone to the forest. His mother was down in the basement. And, of course, the king insisted that the woman be brought before him. Now, the young man was afraid that both he and his mother were going to be punished. But when that woman came up the stairs into the daylight and felt the warmth of the sun on her face for the first time in months, she grinned from ear to ear. "Old woman, where did you get the idea to plow the road?" "Oh, Your Majesty, it wasn't my idea. Why, when I was just a little girl, we had a famine, a lot like this one. And you know, my father plowed the road, and crops grew, and we were saved. And I remember I asked him, why did he do that? And he said that when he was just a little boy, his father had done the very same thing." "Ah," said the king, "I think I understand." "Oh, of course you do, Your Majesty. It's obvious, isn't it? Why, all those years of the carts bumping along the road on their way to market, well, of course some grain fell out. Of course some vegetables bounced out and landed in the dirt and were smushed into the ground. Why, these roads are just farms waiting to happen." And so the king issued a new order. "Go into the forest, find the old people, bring them home." And the soldiers marched back into the forest, and they found most of the old people. Now, a few had not made it through the harsh winter, but most of them had survived because, of course, they had experience and wisdom on their side. And then everyone, young and old together, went out and plowed the roads in front of their houses. And soon the kingdom was crisscrossed with a green network of long, winding gardens. And at harvest time, the king invited everyone to come to the palace for a feast. And that wise old mother sat in the place of honor at the head table right next to the king. And ever since that day, the young and the old work together for the common good, and the kingdom prospers.
Well, thank you, Sue. I'm sure that some of these stories were old favorites of yours, and I hope that some of them were brand new to you. We've given you these stories tonight, and the next time you hear them or tell them, I hope you add a little of yourself into them, because storytelling really is a living art, and stories are never fixed, and neither are their endings.
So that was just the beginning.
And now the story is yours.
Colorín colorado, este cuento se acaba.
And now my story is done. But this story will go on for as long as the grass grows and the rivers run.
The world is a story, a beginning we tell to each other from the day that we're born until the day that we die.
And they lived happily ever after until they died.
And if they didn't live happily ever after, that's nothing to do with you or me.
The end.
Is it still on? It is. Thank you all for coming tonight. Could I just have all the tellers stand up here for one more round of applause? Come on up. Come up here. Come up here. Big bows. Come be with me because these are my compatriots. Thank you for being here. We'd like to feed you cookies just as soon as I thank the 5 artists from the MFA program here at the University of Illinois, Laura Tanner, Jim Graham, Dan Gratz, Joe Gratz, and Amy Gillis, who made the collaborative collage art that you see here tonight. So. I also want to give a special thanks to Sam and Miriam, who had an extra difficult role tonight in being both MCs and tellers, as well as Deborah Stevenson, director of the CCB, without whom I don't think this festival could have happened this year. Thank you. And Ayana, Miriam, note Miriam factors in twice, and Laurel, flowers, who are CCB GAs and so have worked just like crazy to make this happen. Lauren, Stacy, Michelle, Garrett, we owe you thanks for technical support as well. And I want to thank all the CCB volunteers all year round who make this and so many other programs possible. Enjoy and have cookies.
Before we have cookies, we have one final important person to thank, which is Professor Kate McDowell. On behalf of the Center for Children's Books, all of the tellers who've learned so much from this process, and the Graduate School of Library and Information Science, we have some flowers for Kate. Thank you.